really appreciate the opportunity to join you tonight. We at the Maryland Center on Economic Policy have been really pleased with to partner with Jews United for Justice over the year, particularly over the last year or two, around a variety of issues, whether it's fair funding or affordable housing, et cetera. And so I'm really excited to be here and to share more about the state's budget and tax policy and how we make those decisions as a state. You've already been introduced to me, but a lot of you may not know much about the Maryland Center on Economic Policy, so I thought I'd start with a very quick introduction to who we are as an organization. Essentially, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that believes that every Marylander should be able to achieve their full potential in a healthy economy that offers a widely shared and rising standard of living. And for us, similarly to Jews United for Justice, we can't achieve this vision unless we center racial, ethnic, gender, and other forms of equity. And for us, what we mean when we say equity, what I mean when I say equity, is that life outcomes should not be predictable by race, by gender, or other factors which are not under that person's control. We're part of a couple of national networks. We actually have sister organizations in 43 other states, including DC and Virginia. We're part of the State Priorities Partnership, which is a network coordinated by the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And we're also part of the Economic Analysis and Research Network, which is a similar network coordinated by the Economic Policy Institute down in DC that fights for an economy that works for everyone. I mentioned those two connections because one of the things that we can bring to the table when we're working together is we can tap into these national networks if there is, maybe you saw a good example, a good idea from another state, or maybe you saw a bad idea that somebody's trying to bring to Maryland that has happened elsewhere, and we can reach out and bring that collective knowledge about, you know, what happened or what made it possible to pass that good policy, or what was the outcome of that bad policy being implemented somewhere else, and we can arm advocates and then arm policymakers with that information. So let's turn to the state's budget, and I'm going to talk about our budget as a whole, and also our tax system, and then we're going to go through some process, how the budget process works. But I think the place to start is always, why is state fiscal policy central to advancing equity? And I think the answer is pretty simple. Our fiscal policy choices affect children's education, they affect families' economic security, that they affect public health and safety. Shared prosperity and opportunity is one possible outcome of our state fiscal policy choices, but another might be concentrated wealth and power, and this is net worth by race, is the graph you're looking at here, and that's partly a result of policy choices. So the question then is, what choices are we currently making as a state? What choices did policymakers make for the budget that we're currently in? So Maryland's budget starts July 1st. You always name the budget by the year in which it ends. So we're currently in fiscal year 2022. So this year, we have an operating budget of about $52.4 billion. There are sort of three different budgets we sometimes talk about. I'm going to primarily talk about the operating budget tonight, almost exclusively. But I do want to mention that, of course, we have a capital budget where we pay for more long-term investments, buildings, infrastructure, schools, roads, etc. That's about $5.2 billion. We also have what we call a tax expenditure budget, or a shadow budget, which is, I think people are less familiar with, but the idea is that we forego spending money on other things when we give tax breaks away to folks. And so that's what the tax expenditures or tax breaks or tax credits. And so, some of those are good, like the earned income tax credit that lifts low-income families out of poverty. And some of them are bad, like giving the store away to Amazon to try and attract their headquarters, for example. And those tax expenditures don't show up in the budget. But if we didn't give those tax credits away, we would have that money to spend in the budget. So it's a shadow budget. But where I'm going to spend most of my time is talking about the operating budget, because that's really where we have the most influence as advocates and Maryland residents, and also where most of the things that we care about happen. When we look at the general budget, the operating budget, we can break it out itself down even further into 4 broad categories. The first is federal funds, and this year the budget grew more than I would have expected in a normal year because of all the relief bills passing in Congress. A lot more federal dollars came to Maryland, so our budget grew by more than it might have otherwise. But there's about $17.3 billion of federal funds in this budget. There's about $9.4 billion in special funds. Special funds are things where you have a dedicated revenue source that's going to a dedicated purpose, like the casino dollars going to the Education Trust Fund, or the gas tax going to the Transportation Trust Fund, for example. Something like that, where you've identified and dedicated monies for a specific purpose. Higher education gets called out on its own because it has its own revenue sources through tuition and through research grants, things like that. And there's about $4.8 billion there. And then we have everything that's left is in the general fund, and that's almost $21 billion. You might ask, well, what's in that general fund? And here's the 10,000 foot level answer. Almost 30% of that budget is spent on a variety of health related expenditures and investments that the state is making. Almost half is spent on education, if you include higher education, the portion of higher education spending that's in the general fund, followed by public safety and human services and a few other things. But it really, we as a state value health and education. Now, there are, I'm not going to go through all the detail of what exactly was in the budget, but there are a few highlights I might flag. I'm noticing that Matthew Weinstein just joined. He actually is based in Maryland, but also is affiliated with our Utah affiliate. So that's interesting. Welcome, Matthew. So there's a couple of highlights that I just wanted to emphasize out of what the legislature did this year and what the governor did this year. There's our own public pandemic relief in addition to what the federal government did. There's increased investment in education because of the blueprint for Maryland's future that we've been working on for the last 4 years, and including with JUFJ through the Fair Funding Coalition, and a number of other things here. We did leave $2 billion, more than $2 billion in our rainy day fund. That's our savings account as a state, and other reserve funds for unexpected needs. But despite all that, there's still lots of unmet needs across the state, and we're still underinvesting in some communities more than others. I could go around this room. I'm sure all of you could give me an example of an unmet need in your community. The ones that really jump out at us when we look at the state as a whole are the underfunding of public schools, which is starting to change, but is still true. The understaffing of state agencies, and which made ramping up unemployment insurance particularly difficult during this pandemic recession. Changing demographics, particularly as our population ages, and as long-term care costs and other healthcare costs rise very quickly. We are struggling to meet those needs. And I will also say that I think it's also important to remember that this pandemic recession is going to have a long tail. We know that the Great Recession back in 2008, 2009 took almost 10 years for some parts of our state to recover from, particularly low-wage workers, women, and Marylanders of color. And I think it's going to, unfortunately, be the same for this recession as well. So there's lots of unmet needs. We did do there were a couple of other things that the state did this year in the budget. We significantly increased, and through legislation that had budgetary implications, We significantly increased our state earned income tax credit in a variety of ways, including making it available to immigrant taxpayers for the first time. That's a temporary change. We'd like to make that permanent because there are lots of immigrant taxpayers who were left out of a lot of the other pandemic relief bills at the federal and at the state level. We exempted unemployment insurance income from the state income tax. Normally that's taxable income. And there were a variety of programs for small and medium-sized businesses as well. The state is going to use federal dollars for a variety of things, including reimbursing itself for expenditures they made ahead of time on the pandemic response and school construction projects, including upgrading HVAC, et cetera, and a few other things. Again, I'm not going to dive into too much detail on these things because I think the real question that you're interested in is sort of the process. But I want you to have this context before we get to the process so you know what the big picture is. So I sort of gave you one way of looking at the budget. Another way of looking at the budget is what choices are we making between programs? And so one of the ways we might do this, for example, is by comparing how much the state is spending on public safety versus how much it's spending on workforce development. And what we find when we drill into this is that we're spending a lot more on public safety than we are on workforce development. We're only spending about $605 million on workforce development, whereas we're spending almost $455 million on state police and $1.5 billion on incarceration and other activities of the correctional agency. Counties spend another roughly $2 billion on police. About a quarter of that is Baltimore City Police Department. I will note that this is the county numbers are a different budget year than the state numbers here, so we're not exactly comparing apples to oranges, but the contours of what I'm showing you are still true. And so we spend $3.4 billion more on police and corrections than we do on workforce development. Now, this isn't necessarily an argument that the professional staff of the legislature is going to put in front of them. So this is an example of one way in which we, as advocates, can bring greater transparency around the state's budget to Annapolis, is by making these sort of comparisons about what are the choices we're making, where are we foregoing by deciding to invest in incarceration, for example, instead of social services. This is starting to change. The Senate President and the Speaker of the House of Delegates jointly decided that the professional staff has to do a racial equity analysis of criminal justice bills for every criminal justice related bill, but they're not doing it on other types of bills, and that's another area where you as advocates or MedSep, for example, can provide that additional context to policymakers that they don't necessarily have in front of them otherwise if you apply a racial equity lens. We've done this, and I'm not going to go through the next couple of slides, but we've done a series of reports called Budgeting for Opportunity, where we looked at sections of the state's budget through a racial equity lens. So we did one on criminal justice, for example. We have an upcoming paper coming out on affordable housing and a second paper on workforce development. But I'm not going to go into the details of those papers, but that's an example of that kind of analysis that can be helpful and is otherwise not put in front of legislators. You can go to our website at mdeconomy.org and search for Budgeting for Opportunity if you're interested in looking at those papers in more detail. So we're spending $50 billion, but we're still have lots of unmet needs across the state. And so the question is, well, why does one of the wealthiest states in the country struggle to pay for solutions that work for everyone? And the short answer is that our tax system is upside down. Despite the fact that we have the highest median income in the country, but despite the fact that we have more millionaires per capita than any other state in the country, our tax system is upside down. When we look at who pays for state investments, the short answer is that you and I do. Whether it's through our federal taxes and the federal dollars that come back to the state. I will say there's lots of federal spending in the state that doesn't show up in the state's budget. So that's not the sum total of the federal dollars returning to the state, but that's the part that flows through the state's budget. But if we look at the general fund, you see that the individual income tax and the sales and use tax together represent the majority of what is funding the general fund. The corporate tax, the other business taxes are a much smaller share of our revenue system and are a much smaller share of how we pay for the investments the state is making in our communities. So remember, it's that we as individuals pay the majority of operating expenses. But at the same time, the wealthiest among us are paying the smallest share of their income in state and local taxes. So if you make more than $500,000, you're paying about 9% of your income in state and local taxes. If you make less than $24,000, you're paying closer to 10% of your income in state and local taxes. So this is why we talk about how we have an upside down tax system. And so we're trying to fix that. And I know you are too, as we work together in the Fair Funding Coalition. What that means is, if you combine our upside down tax system and the fact that we have unmet needs, and some of which are growing faster than revenue is growing, that we have this slowly widening gap between revenues and expenses, which means that over time we're going to have to either cut investments in our communities or raise revenue to make up the difference. So the question then becomes, can we afford revenue to raise revenue? And the short answer is yes. If you look at state and local taxes as a share of personal income, Maryland is in the middle of the pack. We're basically at the US average, even though we're one of the wealthiest states in the union. So we have room to raise revenue. If you look at business taxes, we're actually better than most states, at least from businesses' perspective. Our business taxes are a much smaller share of Maryland's economy than in most other states. And in fact, Ernst & Young and Cost, which is a business lobbying group, do this analysis every couple of years where they look at how much, among other things, they look at the return on investment that business gets for its tax dollar. And they actually find that Maryland is basically the only state where business gets a positive return on its tax dollar. Maryland businesses get $1.25 back for every dollar they put into state and local taxes. Now I'd love to get a return on investment of that sort, but I also want to be clear that's not a physical $1.25. What that $1.25 is comes back to them in the form of not having to spend as much on training because we have a highly educated workforce, or they don't have to repair their trucks as much because we are mostly repairing our roads. I won't say our roads are in phenomenal condition, but we try. Or that there's a functioning court system, for example, those sorts of things. That's how business gets its tax dollar back. We also remember through the Trump tax cut bill of 2017 made a huge giveaway to very wealthy individuals in the state and across the country, and particularly white wealthy individuals. Across nationwide, only 67% of households are white, but they got 80% of the tax cut benefit in 2017, and you can see it was concentrated heavily in the top 5%. So we really have this sort of choice where do we clean up our tax code and ask large corporations and the wealthy individuals to pay their fair share so we can invest in Maryland communities, or do we weaken public schools? Do we undermine public health? Do we leave more Marylanders homeless? And do we continue to balance the budget on the backs of Black and brown Marylanders? I think my choice is clear about which of those two options I would take. All right, so that is background, and hopefully that is useful context of how the state is currently spending its money. So let's talk about the process and how you might persuade folks to do things differently. What's the current budget process? And oh, by the way, it's about to change in 2023, so we'll talk about that as well. And I thought before I talk about the budget process, just one note about tax bills. So if you want to change a tax, it's just a regular bill in the legislature. So it has to go through the normal process. The budget process is very different, but a tax bill, just the normal bill process. Propose a bill, goes through committee, gets voted on by one chamber and then the other, goes to the governor for their signature, veto, etc. But the budget process is different. And so I think the place to start maybe is talking a little bit about who the players are, and then we'll talk about how they interact and how you can interact with them. And we start with the administration. Obviously, it's Governor Hogan right now. This will change in a couple of years, but right now it's Governor Hogan. And the governor in Maryland for the last 100 years has been the most powerful person in the state when it comes to the state's budget. The governor is the only person currently who can add spending to the budget. The legislature has come up with a few little tricks to get around that on the edges, but basically the only person who can add money to the budget is the governor. And so if you care about a program and you want to see the state put more money into it, here's the place you have to start. You have to start in the administration well before the legislative session starts in January. And so, Senator Brinkley, who heads the Department of Budget and Management, plays a strong role in this process, making recommendations to the governor, as well as the other cabinet secretaries. But I also want to emphasize that if there's an issue you care about and you know the program level staff, lobbying and advocating to them is also very important, because what happens is the governor receives recommendations from the agencies, and so the department maybe the particular program will make a recommendation up to the agency level, and then that'll make it all the way up eventually to the governor's desk. So often the place to start is practically immediately after the legislative session starts, to work with that local program level staff to advocate for your spending increase. The General Assembly, of course, also has a role, and so we're talking about led by Senate President Ferguson and Speaker of the House Jones, and also another important player here is the Department of Legislative Services, essentially the professional staff of the legislature, our version of the Congressional Budget Office or the Congressional Research Service you might be familiar with. DLS is, we're lucky to have DLS. They are not perfect, but they are one of the more professional, well-run legislative staffs in the country. So, I don't always agree with their analysis, but they actually are trying to do their best and trying to do and often do a very professional job. One caveat there is they only can answer questions that they are asked by the legislature. So often our role is to ask other questions and provide analysis beyond the limited questions they might have been asked by the legislature to answer. The third sort of agency for you to be aware of is the Board of Public Works. These three people are incredibly powerful when it comes to Maryland's budget, and will continue to be after the new budget process is in place in 2023. Governor Hogan is the first member and controls the agenda of the Board of Public Works. The Comptroller Franchot, is the second member, and right now he often votes with Governor Hogan and is currently running for governor, so we will have a new Comptroller after the next election. And then the third person on the Board of Public Works is less publicly known, but it's Treasurer Nancy Kopp. Treasurer Kopp is a former legislator, and that position is elected by the General Assembly every 4 years. And she's been the Comptroller for a while. I'm sorry, the Treasurer for quite a while, and is often the dissenting vote when Franchot and Hogan are voting together. At least that's the dynamics at the moment. I will say more about why the Board of Public Works is important as we get to process in a minute. We also have this Joint Spending Affordability Committee. This is a committee that has members from both the Senate and the House of Delegates. It's led by Senator Rosapep and by Delegate Corman. And they kind of set sort of the guardrails around which the budget conversation happens. Once the budget reaches the legislature, then we focus on the Senate Budget and Taxation Committee, chaired by Senator Gazone and vice chaired by Senator Rosapep. And they handle both the budget and revenue bills. The subcommittees are really important. I'm not going to dive into the who's on this committee, all that kind of stuff, but really what you want to do is get in front of the people leading and on the subcommittee that is covering the issue you care about, because then the subcommittee will make recommendations to the full committee, and usually what the subcommittee recommends is what the committee approves. Similarly, on the House side, we separate revenue and budget bills, but the budget is in the Appropriations Committee, led by its chair, Maggie McIntosh, and by its vice chair, Delegate Chang. And again, you can see the subcommittees that are how the work is divided in the House Appropriations Committee. Revenue bills are heard by the Ways and Means Committee, Chair Kaiser and Vice Chair Alonzo Washington. There are several different Washingtons in the General Assembly, so you do need to make sure you know which Washington you're talking about. And you can see that the subcommittees there. So let's talk about the actual cycle and how these different entities interact. So I mentioned the agencies start to develop recommendations as soon as the prior year's budgeting process is over. So they start almost 15 months ahead of when it starts. And the governor provides some guidance, and then they make recommendations so that here's where to start with your advocacy, is with the agencies. One important group that I didn't talk about was the Board of Revenue Estimates. They are who give the official estimates of how much revenue the state might have in the next fiscal year, and they make estimates 3 times a year. The Board of Revenue Estimates is chaired by the Comptroller, but is a separate professional agency, and again, generally, well respected. These are not. It's not a political process coming up with these revenue estimates. It's a fairly professional operation, but it's important to pay attention to those estimates. The Department of Budget and Management then takes the Ways agency recommendations and drafts the budget and works with the governor to figure out what their priorities are, what the governor's priorities are, and incorporating agency feedback. And that happens all the way until midnight the night before they publish the budget. So through early January, that work is ongoing. At the same time, the federal fiscal year starts October 1st. If the federal government actually passes a budget on time, which they don't always do. Actually, they often don't. But in theory, that gives us some sense of what federal dollars are flowing through Maryland. We get a December estimate, and that's kind of the final estimate before the legislative session starts in January. At the same time, in the late fall, early winter, the Spending Affordability Committee is coming together and meeting and hearing testimony from DLS and others, and makes recommendations about sort of how much the budget and the state workforce should grow. Sometimes they set a dollar figure, sometimes they say a percentage. They've done it in various ways over the years, and there's no legal requirement that the governor or legislature has to follow these recommendations, but the standard practice is that they do, in fact, stay within the boundaries sort of set by the Spending Affordability Committee. There's a similar capital Spending Affordability Committee as well. The governor then introduces the budget in January. It's important to know that our state constitution requires that at every major point, the budget must be balanced. So the governor has to introduce a balanced budget. And when the budget is finalized, it also has to be balanced. The governor will hold a press conference. He'll, spin the budget in whatever way he thinks appropriate, and then that can be interesting. But the briefing to actually pay attention to is the Dls Fiscal Briefing that happens the Monday after the governor releases his budget or her budget, and that fiscal briefing, which is available online, really the professional staff's first take on the issues in the budget. They flag areas of where the legislature is going to need to take action to effectuate various changes the governor is asking for, or they flag areas where the legislature might have different priorities than the governor, et cetera. And so that fiscal briefing is really important to pay attention to. And it's about 90 minutes to 2 hours, and usually fairly straightforward. I think it's one of the more approachable fiscal briefings, put it that way. The legislature then takes the budget bill up and holds hearings by agency. You can listen to those hearings and you can submit testimony, written testimony, but you can't testify verbally usually. The agency will submit its testimony, DLS will submit its analysis of each agency. And those, so if you care about a particular program or agency, pay attention to those hearings, call, email, reach out to the legislators on the budget committees about issues you might have with any of those agency budgets. The legislature, under the current process, cannot add to the budget. They can only cut. They can decline to change a mandate. So, for example, education funding, we have a formula that drives that funding. And if the governor wanted to make a cut to education and said, well, he has to say, well, I want to change the formula, the legislature can decline to go along with that formula change, and therefore might pass a budget that has a higher education funding than the governor proposed. They will still have to make cuts in other areas because, again, they have to pass a balanced budget. But that is one of the main ways they work their way around the limitation around adding to the budget currently is through mandates. If you pass a mandate, one important thing to know is if you pass a mandate this year, you cannot mandate, if it's a new mandate, it can't mandate spending in the budget under consideration. It can only mandate spending in the budget the next time around. So there's always a year delay if you create a new mandate for spending. So that's the process the legislature is going through. We get the final revenue estimates come out in March before we pass the budget. The governor may submit supplemental budgets, maybe not. If you have a governor and a legislature that like each other, if the legislature wants to add money to something, they can go and say, hey, governor, can you please submit a supplemental budget? If they don't like each other, the legislature can say, no, we're not interested in taking that supplemental budget up. They have to take the original budget proposal up, but they don't have to take supplemental budgets up. Governor Hogan found that out to his chagrin in the first year of his administration. But then by the end, early April, the legislature approves the budget. If they don't approve the budget, they have to go into extended session. It's the only bill that has to pass by, according to our state constitution. So if they go into extended session, then they can't talk about anything else. They can only talk about the budget. That budget does not require the governor's signature. Once they pass it, it is the budget, and it must be balanced again. Counties in Baltimore City start then finalizing their own budgets. After the state budget's final, agencies start implementing the budget, start working on the next budget. And you might have noticed I didn't say anything about the Board of Public Works. Here's why the Board of Public Works is very important. Those three people can come together and on a simple majority vote, cut individual line items outside of the legislative session by up to 25%. This is an important power to have somewhere because if, for example, the state's finances crash for some reason, maybe a hurricane hit the state and tax collections are way down, or whatever, you need some flexibility in your ability to cut spending. So in Maryland, this is where it resides. And like I said, the governor controls the agenda of the Board of Public Works, and right now, quite often, Francho votes with Hogan, and so he's able to do most, although not everything, that he'd like to do. The Board of Public Works meets every other Wednesday. They publish their agenda the Friday before that. So it's important to at least skim that agenda to make sure that there's nothing you care about that's being proposed for cutting. And if there is something that is being proposed, a cut that's being proposed, you have just under a week to make your voice heard to those 3 individuals. But that's more time than there used to be. They used to be able to publish that agenda the morning of, and you had no time. So that's a positive change. All right, so this is the life cycle for the state's budget, creating the budget until January 2023, when these 2 things are going to change. And specifically what's changing is the legislators will be able to increase the budget for their priorities for the first time since 1916. They will have to raise revenue or cut other areas, again, to maintain the balanced budget. The governor is going to gain the ability to line item veto any item that is larger than the governor proposed originally. And if they veto something, then the budget for that line item reverts to the level the governor originally proposed. And the surplus will go back into the operating, it essentially just goes back into our savings account. So I just threw a lot of information at you. So I'm going to stop there. But I am happy to answer questions. You've got me until about 9 o'clock, and I really appreciate the work that we're doing together in Annapolis and the opportunity to speak to you tonight. And I'll shut up and let's hear if we have questions.
Thank you, Benjamin. That was a lot to think about, and we have quite a number of questions. I'll start off with a relatively easy one. There were no property taxes on slide 20. Where do they come into consideration?
Property taxes generally go to the counties, and so the state has a very tiny proportion of the property tax goes to the state, but it primarily goes to county budgets. So that's why we're not talking about it here today.
Okay. Has Maryland always been such a low revenue state, or is this just when we have GOP governors?
So it is equally difficult to pass revenue increases or to I've been doing this work for a long time, and it's never easy to get revenue bills through the legislature, which has been democratically controlled for decades. I don't think that it matters too much. It's certainly harder because Governor Hogan ran on a platform of anti-tax. So you have to be able to achieve, anything you have to be able to override the governor's veto. So that raises the bar a little bit, but it's always it always requires a lot of work by average citizens to get a tax bill passed in Annapolis, no matter who's in the governor's house.
Thanks. Are there any other examples of states that have cleaned up their tax code that we could look at?
Yeah, so pretty much all states' tax systems are upside down. Some are a little bit better than Maryland's. Some are much worse than Maryland's. There are a few things, so for example, I mentioned that JUFJ and Maryland and MedSep are part of the Fair Funding Coalition. And one of the bills that we've been pushing through that coalition is something called combined reporting, which is kind of a wonky name, but essentially what it means is, large multi-state corporations ought to pay their fair taxes, share of taxes, just like small local businesses do. It would close a loophole that allows these multi-state corporations to artificially send profits out of Maryland and pretend they didn't happen here. And this is totally legal in Maryland. But more than half of states in the country have closed this loophole, including lots of very red states like Texas, for example. So that's a way in which our tax system is worse than Texas. It's better than Texas in other ways, but that's one example of where we've really failed to close this loophole for a long time, and it continues to put our local businesses, who actually create most of the jobs in the state, are small local businesses, and gives preferential treatment to these big multi-state corporations. So that's one example of something we could be doing better.
We have the process where we have a bill passing and then getting funded very disconnected, like the women's pre-release facility. Is that common elsewhere, or is that something that can get fixed?
So it is pretty common. We have a lot of different special funds that we've created over the years that don't have any money in them. Or, for example, we worked on, both our organizations worked on the tenant's right to counsel this past year, for example. And I may be forgetting the details exactly, but I think that bill passed, but then we didn't put any money behind it. So it's sort of not actually a tenant protection like we hope. So yeah, that is super common. And it is not something that I see an easy fix for, other than you just simply having to persuade policymakers that that it has to be funded, whether it's, just through general operating support, or, sometimes that's why we have special funds, because we've identified a particular funding source for a particular purpose. So sometimes that's one way that advocates or policymakers get around that. But it is not uncommon for that to happen here in Maryland or elsewhere in the country. There's also sometimes, I'm not actually sure if this is more of I think this is more of a county limitation, but for example, here in Baltimore City, where I live and where our offices are located, we created this Affordable Housing Trust Fund, but we had to go, and we could create the trust fund through the city council, but we then had to go to the voters to create the revenue source to pay for the trust fund. So sometimes there's weird little quirks of state or local law around who actually has the authority to create the revenue stream for the item, if you're not going to get general operating support. So it can be a little complicated sometimes.
Do advocates frequently submit testimony at these budget hearings, or is that less frequent? Where's the best place for advocates to get involved?
Yeah, so I think one of the things I'm trying to make clear in my presentation is that while the work that happens in the General Assembly on the budget is important, it's really important to work with the agency ahead of time. You always have a higher chance of success if you can get the agency to advocate for the budget increase, and not find yourself in the position of advocating for a funding increase that the agency is saying it doesn't need, for example. So it's vitally important to work with the agencies. But it is common to submit written testimony to the legislature around various, agency budgets. We do it through a lot of our coalitions pretty frequently. I always remind people, remember, legislators are very busy people. They have to consider 33,000 bills in 90 days. And so the shorter and more to the point you can be with those sorts of things, the better. But yes, absolutely submit written testimony to those sorts of things.
Great, thanks. Getting to the Board of Public Works, have they cut things for political reasons or policy reasons? Which is the more often that's happened, rather than purely budgetary reasons?
So because the legislature can't increase spending, most of the time it's for revenue reasons. I haven't actually seen all that many political cuts, although you never know exactly what's going on behind closed doors. There was for example, state contracts come in front of the Board of Public Works as well. So for example, a couple of years ago, the state wanted to privatize I think it was the cafeteria at a state hospital in Western Maryland, And the state employees union got wind of this, very quickly pulled together testimony from its members and was able to persuade the Board of Works to not privatize the cafeteria at the state hospital. And that's an example of where Governor Hogan had one priority and the Comptroller and the Treasurer had a different priority. And so there's been a lot of back and forth on the Board of Public Works recently about contracts, emergency contracts related to pandemic spending too. So you do see some political conversations happening, or there's concerns raised about whether certain contracts are being given for political reasons. But because the governor holds so much power in the budget, the normal budget process, most of the cuts have been more around like either something is no longer needed or there's a revenue drop. Governor O'Malley used this power during the Great Recession, for example, when the state's revenues cratered, to maintain a balanced budget and not decimate our reserves as a state, for example.
Great. Can you speak a little bit to the dynamic between the chairs of the committee that do the budget and the leadership in the Senate and the House?
I would say that the committee chairs are highly coordinated between themselves and the leadership. They're part of leadership, and there's a lot of, when we elected a new Senate president and new speaker a couple years ago, those committee chairs were all vying for those seats, but there's a lot of coordination because they're part of leadership, for sure. I think that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Can the governor refuse to spend funds in an approved budget or unilaterally reallocate funds?
Yes. He can't reallocate funds, but he can refuse to spend funds. So, for example, a few years ago, I'm forgetting exactly when this was, the legislature took the governor's budget, they made a bunch of cuts, and then they said, okay, so we have, I think it was $200 million, if I recall correctly, that we've found out of this $46 billion budget. And we can't require you to spend it on these priorities because we can't increase funding. But we are setting aside this money and asking you to spend it on schools and some other things that I don't remember off the top of my head. And Governor Hogan declined to spend. He spent a few of the things they had listed as priorities, but most of it he said, nope, not doing that, and it just went back into the state's reserves. That was sort of an unusual tactic the legislature took, that they don't normally do that, and it was sort of I think it was more of a way to set themselves in opposition to the governor than anything. I don't know that they necessarily had high hopes that it would actually work, but it does sometimes happen. But in general, all the dollars that get budgeted get spent in most budget years.
How much change to tax policy happen incrementally in a typically legislative session rather than in a big reform package that might only happen once, very rarely, actually?
So the incremental change that happens around tax revenue is generally through tax credits. So you'll see dozens of little bills with not huge revenue implications for tax credits, which really are, revenue cuts to state revenue because they're tax credits. We get lots of those, and most of them I don't think are good ideas. A handful of them I might like, but the sort of incremental change will happen that way, or we'll see. There might be a tweak to the cigarette tax, for example. Might when vaping became more popular, then we had to do some tweaks. The state did some tweaks around how it taxed tobacco, and cigars and things like that. So it happens. You know, there's always bills under consideration every year, but they're pretty minor in terms of sort of revenue implications.
Hogan has said he's very good. He's a politician, and he says he supports something and then fails to request or allocate the money in the budget for it. And people just remember that he said he's for something. How can we hold the governor accountable for this type of action?
Talk to your friends and neighbors. You know, it is. You know, we're a nonpartisan organization, but there's a lot of fuzzy math coming out of the governor's office, and it really is about you know, spreading the word about what you're seeing. You know, it's one of the things I always tell people is that Annapolis is a very small place, and I've seen bills pass or changes to bills made because 5 people called the right legislator, or the right person was in the room testifying when a bill was being heard and had a personal story to share. You know, again, you don't want to waste their time. You want to be like really direct and to the point and clear, and not you know, go over the time limits they give for verbal testimony, things like that. But if you're in the room and you are making the point, and you've managed to get 10 of your friends to call the legislator about an issue, sometimes that can move the needle. It doesn't take a lot of calls or emails for it to seem like, oh, this is suddenly a big deal to a legislator in Annapolis. Annapolis is not Congress.
Great, thanks. We have time for just one more question. Where or how is it decided how much a state can borrow for capital spending?
So the state has set limits on its share of spending, and those limits are constitutional, if I recall correctly. We don't work on the capital budget as much, but I believe they're constitutional, and they're essentially a percentage of the state's total personal income or total property tax, that sort of set a cap on state spending, state borrowing, and that borrowing is passed through the legislature. Sorry, it's getting late. As a regular bill. So the capital budget, unlike the operating budget, the capital budget is a regular bill, moves through the legislature just like a regular bill. The governor can sign it or veto it, just like a normal bill. And so, or series of bills rather. So it's kind of just, that's how we make those decisions. But the total limit is set in state law as a percentage of basically of the state's ability to raise funds. And that's part of why the state has a AAA bond rating, is because we are prudent about where we set those limits.
Great. Thank you again, Ben, for sharing your knowledge with us through your presentation and the time you've given us through the question and answer session. We're so grateful to have learned from you this evening. And I'm now going to pass. Thank you again. I'm now going to pass to Anita Lempel, who will connect the Maryland budget and funding to JUFJ's work.
Well, thanks again to Ben Orr for that presentation, and to Heidi for leading the Q&A. While JFJ has worked extensively with coalition partners on a number of issues that interact with the budget process, we have not focused yet on how we as advocates can influence the state budget directly. More on that in a moment. Now, given everything you've heard so far tonight, please let us know in the chat what budget-related issues you feel passionate about in Maryland. I'll give you a moment to do that. And while you're putting your issues in or thanking Ben for his wonderful presentation, I'm going to talk a bit more about the statewide legislative issues that we are working on and how these have ended up having a strong connection to the state budget. So two of the issues that were worked on in 2021 stand out as being having particularly striking connections to the budget process. The Women's Pre-Release Center, which Heidi referred to, and the Renters' Right to Counsel, which Ben referred to. The Women's Pre-Release Equity Coalition had been fighting for years to pass legislation to require the establishment of a community-based women's pre-release facility in Maryland that will support incarcerated women as they prepare to return to their communities. Now, the state has several facilities like this for men. The legislation for a women's pre-release facility passed in 2020, but was vetoed by the governor. Thankfully, we were able to secure a veto override of the bill in 2021. However, no funding was included in the budget by the governor, and without the funding, the Department of Corrections will not move forward on the implementation of the legislation. This lack of inclusion in the budget has created yet another hurdle for a bill that advocates have been fighting for years, and renders the legislature's twice given support of such a gender equity need in the criminal justice system null and void. Leading up to and throughout the 2022 legislative session, JUFJ will be continuing to work with coalition partners to ensure the necessary funding is allocated in the budget. And I see schools, pre-release, Renters' Right to Counsel, all of which we are definitely strongly interested in. So here is the second issue that JUFJ has worked on systematically that is impacted by the budget. That is assisting renters facing eviction. This past year, JFJ continued its work with the statewide housing coalition Renters United for Maryland, otherwise known as RUM. During the 2021 legislative session, the coalition fought for a comprehensive housing justice package that would have addressed both the immediate emergency housing crisis during the ongoing pandemic and long-term systemic changes to the rent court system in Maryland that leans heavily in favor of landlords. While the legislature failed to pass many of the needed reforms, they were able to pass access to counsel, which will help ensure that all tenants have access to legal representation in eviction proceedings. Now, legal representation for a tenant is the single largest factor in preventing eviction from moving forward. Access to counsel is a big win, but unfortunately, the legislature failed to pass a bill that would have provided the necessary funding for this. The funding is absolutely crucial to ensuring that tenants have legal representation, and RUM, along with JFJ and other partners, will now be working to pass that legislation in the 2022 legislative session. As JUFJ moves forward in the next weeks and months, legislation that we support will undoubtedly have some type of interaction with the budget. As we all know, money makes the world go round. Change almost always requires funding if it involves government. Now, Carol will be talking next about actions that we can take now and what is on JUFJ's schedule coming up. Carol?